Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Findmypast webinar. For those of you who know me, welcome back, and for those of you who don't, I'm Myko Clelland, family historian at Findmypast. Today, I'm going to take some time to talk about parish records, those wonderful documents that any genealogist doing research in Britain needs to make their best friend. They're the most important records we can use when we're telling our family story and taking it back all the way up to the 1500s. There's a chat box where you can ask questions as we go, so don't be shy. We'll hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for questions, but type things in as we go through the presentation, and myself or one of our team will hopefully be able to get you the answers that you want straight away. I'm aiming to give a little bit for everyone in this talk, no matter how experienced you are, but with anything we're studying, context is king. We hear the term, most of us probably know what the records cover, but before we explore how they can help with family history, what exactly are they? And that's a bigger question than you might think, but it's probably the most important. Here's an early example. We scan our records in full colour where we can, and then luckily, in case you're feeling daunted by that, we transcribe them too. These records give us the names and the dates that we need to build our family tree, and we can use other records to then tell stories and find even more information. They came about as a result of an order given in 1538 by Henry VIII to record and store safely information about every baptism, marriage and burial in the country on parchment or paper. This was the first time that a serious attempt to register the details of commoners took place, and before this point, if you weren't part of a prominent family, records most likely wouldn't have been kept for you. There's a bit of a precedent, as I think we're all too aware of even today, that when a government wants to keep a record of things, though, it's usually because they want to tax it. And because of this, it was so poorly obeyed and mistrusted as an order that it had to be repeated a few years later in 1547. Even then, we find it wasn't until 1598 that things became organised and prevalent. Records were then instructed to be kept in books, which were much harder to lose, obviously, and then they were backdated to 1538. And you're lucky to have something that goes back to this time. It shows you must have had very careful and caring parish officials. Seemingly pretty obviously, parish records are divided by parish. But what is that, and what do we need to know when we start looking at this in detail? A parish is an area administered by a single church. It gives us straight away a place that our ancestors were buried, married or baptised. But that's not all. Don't forget that when parishes were created, they were for the most part equal in population. But as demographics changed, boundaries were adjusted, and in some cases new parishes were created from larger, more rural areas. Some outlying villages never had parishes of their own, and these people would attend another local church. So remember that your location here is not always your residency. It's often noted in individual records as well, but there were more than 15,600 parishes in 1835, just to show you how many of these exist. And to give you a better idea, I can't emphasise enough when you're looking at parishes how understanding that parish helps you in family history. People are fairly pragmatic when it comes to day-to-day life, even today, especially in the past. So if, for example, there's perhaps a church that's further away geographically, but it's at the top of a large hill, you can bet your ancestors probably chose the church that was the nice, easy walk away, even if it was a little bit longer to get to. With maps, we can see that much, much more easily. Parishes are part of a diocese, which is run by a bishop, of which there are many in England and Wales, and we'll cover why that's important later. But they're also part of an archdiocese, and this can be very useful when hunting for new records too. It wasn't until 12th of January 1858 that even wills were separated from being administered by the church, but we can look for these earlier wills going right the way back to the 1300s in the Prerogative Court of Canterbury and York. Even diocese boundaries can change, so do bear that in mind as well, and keep checking those maps, but they can again guide us to new records. We won't cover them in this presentation, but wills are fantastic as a resource, and Findmypast has a great collection from these archdioceses. So when your tree starts to grow, go back with the names and dates that you have, and you can really find something special in there. Now we've covered a few basics to help you frame these records, let's get straight into the records themselves, starting at a natural place, baptisms. These are the first place we need to look for any births before 1837, and an unknown but small number of births weren't registered in the early years of civil registration, so it's still useful even beyond that. In them, we see the name of the baptised, date and place of the baptism, the name of the parents, and sometimes much more, particularly as we move later in history. Details like the mother's name originally weren't included, but again, over time, they appear, particularly from the late 16th century onwards. Remember, the biggest and most common mistake to make when starting out, baptism dates that we get from these parish records are not birth dates. They could have happened on the same day, yes, but that would have been rare. For the most part, they happened a little while after birth, and sometimes they were later for a number of reasons. In some cases, they could be even up to a few years later. The birth date can be mentioned in the record, but remember that if not, you're looking at a baptism rather than a birth. Banns records are next if we follow from birth to death. Many overlook these records, but everything is useful, and there are a number of these records online that we can explore. Banns are the first stage of the marriage process. They're the calling aloud in the church of a request for anyone who might know of a reason for two people not to be married. This usually happened once a week for 3 weeks, and then the marriage occurred soon afterwards. Much like with baptismal records, remember they aren't marriage dates, and they reflect a very different event. They're different to marriage licenses, where in exchange for a fee and a sworn declaration, that period could be waived. Obviously, of course, the wealthy would never lie, would they? You can see a note on marriage records that are by banns or by licence, and that really helps to give us a starting idea of if our ancestors were well-to-do and of their social status. After 1753, rule changes mean you're far more likely to find banns records. It became a legal requirement to call banns or to obtain a marriage licence from this point onwards. Many fewer banns books survive than marriage registers, but they do exist and they can really help, so don't forget to look for these too. When banns are declared or a licence fee is paid, then a marriage takes place, and of course, for our family history, they might be the most important records of all. Marriage records cover Anglican unions. Parish records are religious in nature, with some exceptions obviously, so we'll cover those later. Don't forget that the minority of the population were of other denominations, and you'll be looking for the records if so. Another common pitfall is trying to stretch records to suit our needs. Sometimes that perfect record isn't there, and there could be any number of explanations for that. Keep looking and think laterally. With ages, the minimum was set to 16 in 1763 unless a special licence was granted, which didn't happen very often. If someone is below this age, think very carefully before looking and adding that record to your family tree. Divorces were very hard to come by, so you probably won't be looking for those either. People were more likely to simply move to a different town and claim to be widowed or a widower than attempt to do something like that. So marriage really was for life back then, unless you died or were clever enough to start a new one. From 1837, you'll see marriages with the same information that you'll find on a civil register. So if you find a parish marriage, you'll save yourself some money from the GRO, and that's another great reason to explore them often. Look out for terms like OTP, which means of this parish, something that took some years of residence in an area to get, and sojourner, which means someone has travelled to that place to marry and actually lives elsewhere. They can even include more still. Inspect every part of a record always. Notes from officials can still show a lot more. In this case, for example, we see a young, gape-mouthed, lazy fellow marrying Hannah Matthews, an old, toothless, wriggling hag. Rather a vivid description we probably won't see anywhere else, and perhaps for good reason. Another example before we move on. Again, these extra notes can really help us. Even here, we see social history and we understand a little bit more context around what we're looking at. This was considered, and I quote, a peculiar marriage. And note the very large "Behold!" in the top left. A Daniel Broadbent, aged 23, married a Martha Cheetham, aged 83. There are far too many other examples to keep listing, but all of this information is important. One example, for example, if you see the note that someone is married an Egyptian, it doesn't refer to the nationalities we think of it, but often what we now sometimes call gypsies, with the old belief that they all originated from Egypt. When we mention marriages, there's a particular place that we've all probably heard of that becomes rather significant. Gretna Green. It's a town just over the Scottish border, and it's acquired something of a reputation for romance. But why? Scotland had and has a different legal system to England and Wales, meaning that Scottish courts didn't apply the Marriage Act of 1753, the one they rather call grandly an Act for the better preventing of clandestine marriage, or Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act, in simple terms, after the man who sponsored it, which brought the calling in of banns as a requirement that we've mentioned, but also it came with new official requirements for an official ceremony, which was performed in a church, and everyone under 21 had to have parental consent. Now, we've all been there. That first time you fall in love, it's definitely forever, and you want to spend the rest of your life with them. So whatever your parents think or say, from this point, we started to see young couples increasingly run across the border to Scotland, where they could marry quickly and easily without the need of any parental approval. Gretna Green was one of the first towns across the border, so it quickly became a go-to spot for these young romantics. If you can't find a marriage in England, perhaps take a look across the border and see if your relations eloped, but your window tends to sit between 1753 and 1856. That was the point when a 21-day residency requirement came into force. You can imagine that no matter how much you think you want to spend the rest of your life with someone, after 21 days in their company, you can quite often change your mind. So the appeal was drastically reduced almost overnight. The romance of Gretna remains, though. So 1 in 6 marriages in Scotland, even today, happen in Gretna Green. If your relatives were married in Gretna, they may just have been married by this man, Richard Renison. He registered more than 5,000 marriages just by himself. He was the very last Anvil priest there between 1926 and 1940. The kind of person married here varied wildly, so always check if you can't find your relations, but it was also noted that he was known to not confirm the requirement that one person had lived in Scotland for 21 days, leading to a number of English marriages that still slipped through the net, even this late in history. These were irregular marriages, though, which is a slightly different concept that we'll cover when we talk about Scotland a little bit later. The final page of any life story contains a burial. That final resting place where all can pay respects, and the records of that ceremony can not only lead us to the monuments themselves, but if the stones no longer survive, they can tell us much more. The Burial Act of 1853 allowed for the creation of new government cemeteries, but before that, almost all burials we look at were in the local parish churchyard, and this is where we need to go to find monumental inscriptions. Although we might not find a lot in a burial record, these can help us to get to the gravestone or the tomb that might show us an age, occupation, relatives, and much, much more. These cemeteries often were quite small, and as they began to fill up, the government needed a new solution. After the 1850 Metropolitan Interment Act, starting with London of course, public cemeteries began to start appearing. Parish church burials from this point began to decline, rather slowly at first, and then you have civil burial registers to explore. But they still happen even today, so keep looking in all of those burial books too. When we explore burial registers, there's a particular law that may again help to give you a little more context and understanding. The Burying in Woollen Acts. It's strange sounding, I know, but bear with me, it can be useful. In 1666, England had just come out of a very bloody and expensive civil war with a real problem. They needed money, lots of it, and from anywhere. So call this one of the very first stealth taxes. From 1666 to 1680, the wool trade was in need of a boost, and what better way than to force people to buy from it? Everyone in the nation, aside from those that were utterly destitute or victims of the plague, as they didn't quite yet understand how it really worked, they had to be buried in a shroud made of English wool. Church officials would witness this, but if it wasn't seen by the author of the book, a living relative of the deceased would have to then swear that it had actually taken place, and you'll see this in registers with the word affidavit next to them to denote that this had happened. If someone was too poor to afford a shroud, then they would be listed as being buried naked, which of course doesn't mean what you'd assume. The Act was still in force right the way up to 1814, but after 1770 it was for the most part ignored. If you see that someone was buried naked, you can get a real feel for the amount of money that person might have had and the social status they must have held. But beware also, there are some instances known of the idea of spending eternity wrapped in English wool being so terrible a thought that they go up against that some rich people would leave a provision in their will to pay the £5 fine for non-compliance, and then they could perhaps rest in peace. We've talked about 1538 and the inception of the parish record system, plus a few more we've noted, but there are a number of other dates that we need to be aware of to understand parish records fully. First, and possibly most transformatively, the English Civil Wars of 1642 to 1651 and subsequent restoration. Throughout the wars themselves, many records were destroyed in the fighting, but often for safekeeping they were buried and simply never recovered, or when they had, they were decayed too much to be of use. There's one particular parish register I know of that was buried on a farm, and it was discovered by a farmer with his pitchforks. So there are 3 very large holes going right the way through the middle of the book, and you can bet that's where your ancestors are. When England stood as a commonwealth without a monarchy, records weren't very well kept at all, requiring an order from Parliament in 1653 to appoint parish registers. People, not books, of course, to record the events officially. Many of these people were dismissed as soon as the Reformation came around, and quite often their records were destroyed when the new parish clerk, who many times was simply just the old one resuming his position again, took up their pen and began their own work. Lady Day is something we don't tend to celebrate nowadays, but it can throw our family history into chaos if we're not aware of it, so it's really important to remember. The 25th of March was the feast of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin, the Lady, of course. This was the beginning of the new year, and traditionally that was when farmers began their work for that year's sowing and harvesting. Up until 1752, this was when a calendar year moved up one, meaning that February was in 1740, for example, and 1741 began in March. This can throw your year out if we're looking earlier, and you can see this most heavily when you see NS, referring to new style during this period, if a priest had adjusted this accordingly for us. But if not, we really need to be aware. Do we adjust these dates to keep them in line with the calendar that we use for the rest of our family history, or do we leave them? Days were lost also during the move to a Gregorian calendar, meaning the adjustment puts Lady Day now at the start of April. And that's the start of the British tax year today, so we still see an element of that even now. A big date for those looking for more information about their family history is the 1812 Parochial Registers Act, also known as Rose's Act. For family history, this is simply huge. It required the use of specially printed registers for the very first time, and it separated out baptism, marriage and burial records as well. Baptisms, marriages and burials also had a requirement of a minimum amount of information for the first time. So that included names, addresses and occupations of parents in relation to baptism. Burial registers included age and place of residence of where the deceased came from. And then marriages, they changed the least, but they were given more space than before. And they changed again in 1837 to become exactly the same as the ones we see at the GRO. We can see the difference very, very markedly. This, as we sure probably have seen before, quickly becomes this, which is something that is far more useful to a family historian and absolutely wonderful to see. It's neat, it's ordered, it's sensible, it's everything where we need to see it, and standardisation means we know exactly where to find what we want. Also, what we want is going to be there in the first place. As we've seen in some of the things we've covered, parish records sometimes don't survive to the present day, and we have to think of some other way to find out about the baptisms, marriages and burials of our ancestors. For this, we can use bishops' transcripts. In this parish register entry, we can see a little note. It says, "There's been a most shameful neglect of 20 years in this parish without any account of burials, marriages and christenings owing to a drunken curate, Mr. Davis, lately dead." That seems a little unfair. I don't think Mr. Davis has a right to reply. But if, for any other reason, for example, the loss of a book, or perhaps even during the English Civil War, as we've covered, that records don't exist, how can we get a second copy of these records to still get the names and dates inside? And bishops' transcripts are exactly what we need to do just that. An order was given in 1598 that within 1 month of Easter every single year, a copy of the parish register entries for the previous year had to be sent to the local bishop. And these copies often weren't exact. It was a lot of extra work for a parish priest to do. Sometimes they even contain more information, which we'll cover those examples shortly. We have a lot of them on Findmypast. After 1812, they started to become more or less exact copies of original registers, so there's less use in them. But they're very, very useful when either registers have been lost or, for whatever reason, perhaps an ink stain, perhaps even a large pitchfork hole going right through the centre. A particular entry in a parish register can't be read, and in that case we have a second go at trying to decipher that information by taking a look at the bishop's transcript. After 1837 and the introduction of civil registration, these transcripts declined somewhat. They were less likely to be sent to the bishop and more likely to be sent to the local registrar, but a handful were still sent, and it's still worth looking here, especially if we think we may be missing a certain element of information. I mentioned that some bishops' transcripts have more information than original parish registers and other bishops' transcripts. There are very few of them, but when we do find them, they're wonderful for family history research. I'm going to show you a couple of very special ones now, and hopefully you'll be able to find them too. We have a huge collection of these online as part of our Yorkshire collection and from elsewhere, so take a look. And you may find something really useful to help you get that little bit further back. A great example, and one we've got on Findmypast to look at straight away, is that of the Dade Registers, named after a great man, or at least great for genealogists like us, William Dade. William Dade, born in around 1740, from around 1763 until his death in 1790, was curate, vicar and rector of 7 parishes in Yorkshire, and he was something of an information obsessive. He included absolutely as much detail as he could about the events he covered, and he deliberately made things as easy as possible for future researchers to get what they needed. I think he's fantastic already. When the Archbishop of York saw these registers, he was so impressed that he introduced them all the way through his diocese from 1707 onwards. They really are a fantastic example of why you should always look at bishops' transcripts. They give us so much information: name, date of birth as well as baptism, seniority of birth, if someone is the third son, for example, the name of the father, their profession, where they live, and their parents' names, with the same information about the mother too. These registers were so known that they're now used as a bit of a byword for any register with more detail than is strictly required. It was so much extra work that as soon as 1812 came around and that standardisation came in that we've just covered, it became the reason for parish priests to stop, and it quickly fell out of use. Our second special register type, Barrington Registers. Though relatively uncommon, the usefulness of these records makes things really important to follow up on and know what we're looking at when we find them. He was a man after our own heart. He was a genealogist. He knew that future family historians would make such use of these records, he wanted much more information included, in this case for all in Northumberland and Durham. This started in 1797 and ended in 1812 with the Parochial Registers Act. Much like with Dade Registers, when there was a legal national statement on what should be included, and that happens to be much less work than what you're doing, you'll find it's a very useful excuse to stop doing all that extra work and make your life a little bit easier. Much the pity for us, of course. If your ancestors are born just outside of this, then the extra information in here relating to perhaps siblings of a family can still be useful. Make the most of it and still tie it back to your family tree. I mentioned a little earlier that parish records were the records of the Church of England. It was the state church and it was the most adhered to, but what about everyone else? From the late 1500s onwards, a number of Protestant churches separated from the Church of England, not least to mention others like Catholics, Jews and the like, who, although, again, not nonconformist, the term applies only to other versions of Protestants, so they won't be covered in parish registers for the most part. Nonconformity was seen as dangerous, and it was attacked by both the Church and the State until the Toleration Act of 1688. You'll remember Guy Fawkes? It was rather dangerous to come out publicly as being anything other than the norm at this sort of period. Often nonconformist baptisms and marriages were done in secret, particularly until 1754, but after the start of civil registration, nonconformists could submit their registers for authentication, and this gave their contents a legal status. Those that were submitted during this amnesty are available at the National Archives in the UK and also here on Findmypast. Often, due to the requirement of a church marriage, you'll find two. One in the church to satisfy a legal obligation, and then a real wedding in the religion that that person belonged to just before or afterwards. So be aware and keep your eyes peeled. Scotland is legally separate from England and Wales as a jurisdiction, so for some of this time it was even a separate country as much as France or Italy. There are some similarities in system, but when you're looking for parish records in Scotland, there are some things to be aware of. Scottish civil registers began in 1855, with the requirement for parish registers starting a little bit later than in England and Wales. The order was given in 1552, but there are none prior to 1553. Scotland had quite a turbulent religious history that's well worth studying further and understanding. Not everyone registered with the Church of Scotland at all, in some cases even as low as 30%, so you may need to think laterally to fill gaps. A peculiarly Scottish tradition that can often stump us is that of irregular marriages. It doesn't mean your ancestors were particularly strange, though, of course, it doesn't say that they weren't. A man and a woman would decide to live together and just say to the world that they were then married. No ceremony, no pomp and circumstance, just going about their lives from that point on as man and wife. It wasn't seen as a great thing by the Scottish Church, though, and you'll find records called kirk sessions which record goings-on of the local parish, often those with a peculiar marriage being fined or punished for their actions, and that marriage then being legitimised. Perhaps that might be the only record of a marriage you'll find, so look for these supplementary records where you can, and then you can still add information to your family tree. Just as with Scotland, there are differences in Ireland also. We could fill a whole presentation with this, and may well do in future, but just to keep you on the right path, there are a couple of hints we can give you to guide you to the right places. Civil registration began in 1864 in Ireland rather than 1837, as we have in England and Wales, but registers are, as we've seen with nonconformists and now know, only for one particular religion. 78% of the population in 1861, for example, was Catholic. 12% Church of Ireland, and then Presbyterians were also much more prominent in the north, and there are other churches also holding sway. Check registers of every religion if you can't find your ancestors. We've only recently published a huge collection of parish registers from right the way across Ireland, and go straight to these if you need to do research in Ireland. But we also have records of Quakers, the Church of Ireland and more, so do look in the same parish area for these same records of a different faith to be sure you don't miss a record. We have the largest collection of Irish records online at Findmypast, so there's a great chance of finding what you're looking for, even though Irish research is traditionally considered a little bit harder than most. The parish record system runs right the way across Europe, and in future we'll cover this in more detail for those with ancestors on the continent, but in the interest of keeping this from becoming a 12-hour-long presentation, here are a few points just to help you along. The first known parish registers anywhere began in the 1400s. Very similarly, the story runs almost parallel to that of England and Wales. All European Catholic Church leaders gathered at the Council of Trent in 1545, and they agreed to standardise their record-keeping practices, mandating that every baptism, marriage and burial in a priest's parish was to be recorded in the same way. This was passed in 1564, and as we remember in England and Wales, in exactly the same way, our European cousins didn't quite take to it straight away, and it took a paper proclamation in 1595 to create universal acceptance. Some areas are very well serviced with original parish registers, though in the most part, few have been digitised. If you've got ancestors on the continent and you experience of our own parish records, you should at least know your way around a little bit more and be in quite a good position. Do take the time, though, to familiarise yourself with the nation in question, its history, the records they use, and the reasons why, rather than apply all that you've learnt today wholesale. You might find a whole lot more too that you otherwise could miss. We know now that religious practice is in decline in modern society. Fewer and fewer people are choosing to baptise, marry and be buried in religious ceremonies. They choose instead to perhaps engage in civil ceremony or, of course, in the case of baptisms, not to have anything at all. But this belief that these later years won't include anything relevant to our family history research is something of a misnomer. Civil registration came into force in 1837, so we can then turn to government registers to find all the information that we need. Initially, they were the responsibility of a registrar, who covered all of the births, marriages and deaths on his patch. They then did their best and they did a good job, but obviously we can't be sure how many of these events they missed if we don't know how many there were. We can extrapolate, and much cleverer people than myself have placed the estimate at around about 5 or 10% of births had been missed, with a much lower amount of deaths and marriages missed too. This continued. Later, of course, as the system bedded in, they got better, not to mention a shifting of responsibility from the registrar to those people present, with a rather heavy fine for non-compliance, brought us up to an estimated 99% by around 1875. The great thing about these records too is that they contain all births, marriages and deaths. No matter your religion, you'll be found here, which helps a lot in an era of the rise of non-conformists and of other faiths too. Though the first port of call now will be the civil registers, church records are still a useful resource. 65% of babies were baptised even as late as 1933, with yes, a marked decline around 21% in 1999, but these odds are still much better than in some record sets, and in family history we really have to take what we can. Any chance to find more information should have us very excited indeed. The final part of this presentation, hopefully now you've been armed with history, context and an understanding of what to look for, is a bit of guidance in making the best of what you find and hopefully getting further. To reiterate, the simplest tips and possibly the most useful: get a map of your parish. Understand more about it in the records that exist. There's a great book I bought from Amazon called the Phillimore Atlas that really is the last word here. It gives you not only parish boundaries, but tells you the years that parish records began to give you even more guidance. I'd also understand the local history to go with an area. Perhaps a parish was split due to a huge increase in population. Maybe there are many more burials due to an epidemic, and maybe that area was a site of a lot of heavy fighting in the past during the civil wars, or a church was destroyed and rebuilt. By knowing this, we might be able to add sense to the madness. Although online we transcribe names and dates, we've covered in a lot of detail that every part of a record is important. When we get further back, it's a skill in itself to be able to decipher some things, and in this extra information might be exactly what we need. Some of these tips are useful with all records, but generally speaking, there are two new kinds of script you'll come into contact with when you're looking at parish registers. The first, the most daunting and luckily only used in the earliest registers, Chancery hand. Daunting, I know, but we can still get information from this with a little bit of guidance. This kind of script can be spotted by the rounded lettering, and it's more common in the centuries preceding the registers that we use. It was already rather rare by the 1660s. The most important elements should be the parts you begin with. Look for names and then read around them. When you find things you recognise, use the letters here to compare with the parts you don't know. Use the power of digital viewing to zoom in and get very close to the letters. But if you don't get where you need to be, print it, go back to it with a set of fresh eyes, and even trace over it with a pen to try and follow the strokes. Maybe that will give you a little bit of inspiration. In the same vein, I've lost count of the number of times I've struggled for weeks over a particular word or phrase, only to have someone I know read it aloud instantly. Show someone else and see what they think. They don't even have to be a family historian. I actually often use a pharmacist friend of mine. She's so used to doctor's handwriting that she's become quite an expert at deciphering these kinds of things. The second script we'll see when using parish registers is secretary hand. A little easier and much more recognisable, but there's plenty to know here too. This tended to be used before about 1700, generally for official documents rather than personal correspondence. There was a roaring trade in finding those capable of writing this way, as written in Samuel Pepys's diary of his struggles to try and find one himself. As with all things, practice makes perfect. It definitely is a skill that comes with time and experience, but start with lowercase letters. They tend to look very similar to the way they do now. Just as with Chancery hand, compare and contrast the letters you know with the confusing parts in the words that you don't. Pay special attention to the few that are often mixed up. C and T, D and E, F and S, I and J, then finally U and V. Sometimes the context of words can help you understand what's missing, so try to make sense of the words surrounding the most difficult part to help you more so. These entries for the most part are quite formulaic, so if perhaps yours is a little more faded, look elsewhere for firmer imprints of similar letters to get you much further along. Before we leave handwriting and script, I have a final point to make. Latin is used in some early registers. It's a terrifying thought, isn't it? That we're going to have to learn a whole new language without even leaving these shores. It's not as bad as it sounds, and here's why. Despite the Reformation, it was still used in official documents right up until 1733, when it was finally officially replaced, with English taking some time to catch on. English was used for the first time in official documents in the 1300s, but it was a language of the common man rather than that of the church and state, so it took quite some time to see that change. Luckily, things did change, and the later we look in history, the more chances we have of finding an English document. Names don't change in Latin, and numbers are still written mostly in Arabic. More usefully, you should be able to recognise or be able to feel out the most useful words without too much effort or the need to learn a whole new language. Mater is mother, pater is father, nomen for name, cognomen for surname, maritus for husband, marita for wife, which is where we derive the word matrimony, birth, nati or natus, again natal, you might be aware of, baptismi or baptizatus for baptism, mortis for death, parentis for parents. I could go on, but I think you get the point. It's nowhere near as daunting as first expected. Findmypast has one of the largest collections of parish records online, but understanding what's there to be found and what isn't is a huge step to mastering your family history. Because something doesn't appear in a search doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. The way that many of these records appear online is that we would sign a partnership with a county or regional archive and digitise the records held by that archive, meaning we've got as close to full coverage as we can get in certain areas. Staffordshire, Cheshire, Yorkshire, Wales, Devon, Westminster, Norfolk, Shropshire, for example, more than any other website. But also, we have a partnership with the Federation of Family History Societies, allowing us to upload transcriptions of parish records from all over the country. This has the added bonus of these transcriptions being written by the societies who know the names. They know the areas, and they know what they're talking about, so it makes things much more likely to be accurate than most. Of course, you should use this as a guide and always try to get hold of the original record when you can to confirm things, but it's a great start and it gives us good coverage. Use our A to Z of record sets, accessible through the drop-down at the top of the screen. That gives us a glossary of everything on our site. When you get to this page, type in the county name and you'll usually see the sets that can help you. The benefit of this too is it now unlocks unique search fields that are only used in that particular record set. A clever thing to do here with baptisms, for example, is to search using the names of the parents in a particular parish, and it'll come straight up with a list of all the children baptised to people of those names there. It's a great start when looking for new leads. Speaking of leads, our family tree gives you clues too across all of our parish record collection. If you have one on Findmypast, you'll see these start to appear without you having to lift a finger. If not, it doesn't cost anything to upload a GEDCOM, so why not try importing it from elsewhere and just seeing what appears? You might be rather pleasantly surprised. We think of parish records as baptisms, marriages and burials, but they actually covered much more than that. They were records of every single penny that went in or out and all related matters to administration of a parish. These are very rarely digitised, but do in many cases still exist and can help. Parish records were stored in a parish chest, a locked box that could be held securely, but inside you'll find apprenticeship papers, settlement certificates where someone's guaranteed to have legally settled in a particular parish, very important for being able to claim money as a pauper, removal orders for money paid by other parishes to look after those who weren't resident, details of any money spent on the poor, rental books, lists of parish officers and all related parish papers in the form of expenses, diaries, minutes of meetings and much more. What's included and what survives varies, but if you have ancestors from one particular place and it's rather closely knit, you really should take a look at these additional documents to see if they can provide supplementary information. We've mentioned already that because something doesn't appear in a search, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and if you're serious about family history, even though we're digitising faster than ever before, sooner or later you're going to have to pay a visit to an archive, pay a researcher to do so for you if you can't yourself perhaps. Familiarise yourself with your parish and area. Understand the records of the period you're looking at, and then go to the archive that covers that area's website first of all to see what they hold. Perhaps they have something on microfilm or in paper form that could fill that gap. Look for maybe civil burial registers as we move into the 1850s, or if we can't find a burial, for example, maybe we can get hold of those parish chest papers and they may give us some more clues. It means we can keep researching even when it appears the trail has gone cold. There's always a new avenue to pursue. If you know what records you want and you can't get them yourself, perhaps being somewhere else in the world, consider hiring a professional nearby who can do it for you. If you know what you want, it can be relatively economical, and it might be that document that proves a link and lets you pick up the trail to carry on researching online. That about brings us to the end of our journey today through time and history. I really hope you've learned something, and I have to thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. If you've any further questions, we'll be here until the end of the hour. We've had some very good ones already, but don't stop. Make the most of the time and keep going by typing into the chat box next to the presentation. Don't have a question? That's all right. Just maybe tell us what you thought of today, and that'll help us shape future webinars. What did you like? What did you not like? I'm going to put some of my favourite pieces of music on now, sit in a comfortable chair and keep answering everything I can with the rest of the team. So do stay with us, listen along and relax. Thank you very much once again for coming, and I hope to see you very soon indeed. Thanks very much. Goodbye.